studies ranging from 22 to 57%. And so domestic violence, as it's associated with homelessness, has actually increased 47% in Missouri between 2014 and 2018. And so specifically, reports of domestic violence experiences and homelessness have actually increased by 193% in St. Louis, with over 5,600 unmet domestic violence service calls. And that included both residential and non-residential. So as you could kind of see, we have this need for increased residential services as it pertains to domestic violence. And so Missouri offers a tax credit for those who donate to domestic violence programs. However, there is more need for residential services. And so House Bill 425 would authorize a tax credit for those who develop housing or rent housing to survivors of domestic violence. The other aspect of this, and this is actually something that's been overlooked in the past, but it's definitely been increasing, is violence against males. So the resources for males who survive domestic violence are not as widespread as the resources for women and children. And so this tax credit for developing housing would help males find accommodations without having to spend a night in their potentially their local jail, which is where they typically end up when they're fleeing abusive situations. And then in some instances, individuals in these situations often have to rely on financial support of an abusive partner, and therefore they can really experience these consequential hurdles that may prevent leaving that abusive partner, and which ultimately kind of promulgates this re-abuse. And so sometimes perpetrators may they exhibit a form of economic abuse, and they can force these individuals to quit their jobs. And so in fact, a significant number of those who experience domestic violence also experience domestic distractions at work and lose their jobs as a result of domestic violence. And again, this ranges across individual studies, but it's somewhere between 21 and 60%. And so the impacts of losing employment are much greater for ethnic minorities and those who make lower wages. And so Senate Bill 16 would permit unpaid leave to survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And this is something that's already in some states, including Illinois and Kansas. And some states even allow leave under the Family Medical Leave Act, or FMLA. But this is not an option that's actually available to Missourians. And then 12 states, including DC, actually provide safe time coverage, which is similar and separate from sick time, which allows paid leave and coverage for domestic violence and sexual violence survivors. And with that, I'll kind of open it up to any questions about those two bills.
So Jill, I just want to ask a quick question here related to something that was written in both of your science notes. So the numbers that you're providing, and I can't remember if you mentioned this, but because of the nature of domestic violence, there also are some limitations to what we know, right? So it could be happening in higher prevalence than what we know about. Could you talk a little bit about the reporting kind of maybe errors?
Yeah, so cases of domestic and sexual violence, ultimately they go they're underreported. Not many people are reporting these instances, and so we don't know the true instances of domestic and sexual violence because of that. A lot of people don't report these incidents because of shame or fear, retaliation. And so ultimately the statistics that we have are just from those reported instances where they're seeking out services.
Well, thank you. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, I just want to remind everybody, if you're just joining us, there were some technical issues, I think, on the Facebook side. I think we're live now. If we are having a conversation about domestic violence and sexual abuse. So if that is something you are sensitive to, make choices based on that. If you are experiencing domestic violence, we have the hotline number on the screen down below. So make sure you call that number, reach out for help. Also, if you have questions for Dr. Joel Barnas or any of us, write those questions into the comment section below the video in the chat, and we'll get right to them. Rachel, do you have any more questions?
Well, I think you did a really good job talking through the science notes, and so I'll share these in the chat here. I guess something maybe you could talk about quick is where these two bills are at in the legislature. I know you testified on one of them last week, and another one maybe had a hearing. So tell us where these are at and kind of what you think about if they're going to, go to the governor's desk this year, maybe.
So Senate Bill 16, that was just heard, I want to say it was just heard last week in the Senate Small Business and Industry Committee. It did not have executive session, so it was just a completion of the public hearing. And then House Bill 425, that was heard this week in the House Committee Ways and Means. And Representative Prouty, who is the sponsor of that bill, she recognizes that this bill needs a lot of work. And so this committee hearing actually was more so of a discussion to figure out ways to improve the bill. I don't think Representative Prouty actually foresees this bill going anywhere this year, but I think Senate Bill 16 has a good chance of making it on moving through the legislative process.
Thanks for that update. It does look like we have a question coming in from Dr. Bratbird. And so can you talk about, with the lack of reporting due to shame and other reasons, how will these bills accommodate people seeking the tax credit or unpaid leave? So how will it, reduce some of those barriers to trying to get some of these needs met, or how will that be handled?
So I think for the tax credit bill, what it will really do is incentivize people to develop or rent housing to people who might need assistance in providing or getting shelter, right? Because we know that shelters, yes, they can accommodate, but sometimes shelters in themselves can be they might not be the best fit for that individual or whatever the case may be. And so providing people with alternatives to acquiring shelter, whether that's, more on their own, or in the case of male victims or male survivors of domestic and sexual abuse, they don't have a lot of resources as it is. So I think, providing an incentive to help get these things developed will ultimately help people be able to access these different resources. But with that, we also have to think about, there's this link with poverty and domestic violence as well. And so we might be able to provide these additional resources, but we also have to think about how these people are going to be able to afford that. And so there has to be a little bit more of a discussion as to how, we might be able to incentivize people to develop them, but how we're actually going to get the people to be able to afford them and be able to access them as well. And then with unpaid leave, what we know, I believe, from the fiscal numbers, that we're not sure how much this is going to really impact these businesses in regards to that, with having to have their employees take time off of work and things of that nature. But I know that they have set limitations on, you get 2 weeks if your business has more than 50 employees. If you have 20 to 49, you only get a week. And then there's no stipulation for if you have less than 20 employees. So we're not entirely sure how these will really have an impact with moving forward. But I think we're at least starting and putting a foot in the right direction.
Dr. Barnas, I have a question for you about some of these domestic violence shelters. How are they currently funded, and why do some policy makers seem to think there's a need for more funding these days?
Yeah, so they are funded through federal funds. And let me actually, so I don't butcher the names of some of these grants here for a hot second. Really quick. So the federal funds include, I'm sorry. So they're funded through the federal government through the Victim of Crime Act grants and STOP grants. And then in state funds, it's the State Services to Victims Fund. And then in addition to that, they get tax-deductible charitable donations. So right now in Missouri, there's an income tax credit for anyone who donates to a domestic violence shelter. And then in addition to that, through court fees as well. So state and local court fees also go into the domestic violence fund. And so I think what we're realizing is that we have these means and methods to help fund these programs, but given the amount of services that are actually not being met, we need to be helping these individuals out who are not getting these services that they need.
So we had a question come through in a private message asking about how COVID has impacted the reporting or incidences of domestic violence or sexual abuse in our state, if we know anything about that.
Yeah, and so I don't know what specifically within our state, but I know there's been a couple of research papers that have come out to show that like hotline abuse calls have actually decreased in some areas by 50%. But reasons for that could be that, you know, these individuals are not in a safe place to make these phone calls and to reach out and get help. And so while we're seeing a decrease in these numbers of domestic and sexual abuse, I think we can safely say that it's probably still going on, and therefore we should not look at COVID numbers to make any sort of decisions about, you know, whether we're going to decrease funding or increase funding or decrease funding to these programs, because, you know, it's just another instance of unreported cases.
Yeah, that's a really good point. This is definitely an anomaly of a year. And so when we're looking back at data on how we provide resources and allocate resources in the future, this year is probably not a good one to base that off of. I think about that in agriculture. You know, we try not to use the really wet years or the really dry years when we're making decisions, but, you know, this is kind of a similar situation.
Yeah.
Are there any other ways that COVID might be affecting domestic violence and domestic abuse?
I think the biggest thing that we're just going to be seeing is that given the social isolation measures that we've taken, that people are just more at home and they just haven't been able to get out of these abusive situations, or they have limited contact with their social circle that they had before. And so I think having those connections to be able to talk to somebody who might be able to help you get help, those are just some limiting factors that we're having with COVID.
Yeah. I know anecdotally from research from talking to different experts in the field that instances of child abuse may have gone up, but are also underreported because of the pandemic. I wonder if anybody's working on any research that might indicate the same for domestic violence.
I think we can and I've actually had a conversation with Dr. Brittany Whitley about this a little bit when we were talking about school counselors and how, with kids being at home and having to be in online school, how are they getting access to school counselors where they can go and talk to somebody about what's going on at home? We don't know how, you know what I mean? If they're not in the physical school, away from a bad situation, how can these kids safely describe what's going on at home? And they might not be able to do that either. And so, yeah, instances of child abuse could definitely be higher given with COVID right now as well.
All right. I have to report that my iPad ran out of batteries, so I'm flying blind here. If there are any more questions in the chat, Rachel and Jill, your guys gonna have to let me know.
Well, it doesn't look like we have any more questions. I suppose we can start to wrap up here. I think, you know, something I take away from this conversation is that, you know, domestic violence and the needs of survivors of domestic violence are going unmet, and there needs to be solutions to try to get to a point where we're supporting the survivors better. And it sounds like this is an issue that's being talked about in Jefferson City, and something that we can probably expect to hear more about next year.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that.
And before we let you go, we'd be remiss if we didn't plug some of our other initiatives going on. We have our Vaccine Equity in Missouri Roundtable coming up at the end of the month. That's the last Friday of the month at 3 p.m. We're going to have some of Missouri's foremost researchers on vaccine hesitancy. We'll talk about different ways that people may become vaccine hesitant, whether it's through religion, whether it's through political identity, and just some of the different excuses people use to say, oh, you know, I'm gonna say no to the vaccine. We're going to talk about all of those factors and different ways that we can get the vaccine out to more people. We also have next week a professional development opportunity. Jill, do you want to give another plug for that for 30 seconds?
Yeah, sign up for our science policy workshop. It's geared towards STEM and social sciences, graduate students and postdocs, to learn a little bit more about science policy and how you can best use your own scientific expertise in civic engagement. It's 3 days. It's going to be a lot of fun. You're not going to want to miss out. And if you sign up early enough, you'll get a free gift.
And it's going to be great at both of the events. So reminder, we're based in central Missouri, but we work with scientists all across the state. So one of the best things about our events is that we usually get a network with people from across the state who are interested in these issues. So that's another perk of joining in.
Yeah. And if you're interested in learning more about those events, signing up, or basically learning more about us, go to mostpolicyinitiative.org and click on Local Science Engagement Network. Under that heading, there's a drop-down menu. You can find signups for all kinds of events, and we'll get you set up with some really good content there.
And I put links to both events in the comments as well, so you can check them out below.
Good deal. All right, if there's nothing else, I guess maybe we'll leave it at that and say Facebook, YouTube, we'll see you next week.
Have a good weekend.
Bye, thank you.
Have a good weekend. Enjoy the weather.